He may even identify himself with it and believe that he is what he appears to be.
Welcome back to the NCE StudyGuide Podcast. I'm Glenn Ostlund. And whether you're studying for the NCE or already working in the field, I'm glad you're here. This podcast is part study tool, part creative experiment. A space where I explore how real-world events and current news stories affect the nervous system and emotional lives of our clients. I think of these as news-inspired case studies, and honestly, I'm creating them for my own continuing education as a soul-centered, trauma-informed counselor. I like to think of this as a little AI puppet show. I use ChatGPT to research, organize, and script these episodes, then feed them into Notebook LM for a deeper dive AI-driven analysis. Then I listen to it and I learn. Together, it helps me connect counseling theory, neuroscience, and the world we're all living in. If you find this interesting or helpful, please share it with a friend or send me your ideas. I'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like a more focused study experience, I've got over 100 topic-specific modules available on Patreon for as little as $5 a month. All right, let's get started.
Today, we are going to create a case study out of a popular news story that has been trending online. We're taking a pretty intense political crisis and turning it into a powerful study tool for NCE preparation. Our mission today is to really dissect the psychological toll of a federal government shutdown and really controversial executive decision. We'll be focusing specifically on ethics, diagnosis, and theoretical application. We're looking at that precise point where, collective political chaos translates into an individual client's complete breakdown of civic faith.
Yeah, and this is maybe one of the most relevant kinds of case studies for counselors who are entering the field right now. We're often taught the biopsychosocial model includes societal factors, right? But sometimes students, they struggle to see that concrete connection. This case of Angela, as we're calling her, shows us exactly how these big legislative and executive failures can, translate into measurable distress. We're talking physical and psychological distress right there in the therapy room. It often manifests as this deep moral injury, a profound sense of betrayal.
Okay, let's jump right into this stressor then. To really get Angela's crisis, we first need to set the scene. It's late October 2025, and the backdrop is, a classic Washington standoff, unfortunately. A federal government shutdown. This one kicked off on October 1st, stemming from a congressional partisan deadlock over a funding bill. Pretty standard stuff, in a way, but what's crucial here is how long it's dragged on and how severe it's become. We're over 3 weeks into this impasse. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers are either furloughed, sent home without pay, or, if they're deemed essential, they're working without compensation. They're basically providing labor for free, just waiting for Congress to get its act together.
And, historically, the thing that usually forces a quick resolution to these shutdowns, it's the public outcry. Especially when politically sensitive groups like military service members go unpaid, that tends to light a fire under Congress. But in this particular scenario, the executive branch did something that really changed the whole dynamic.
Yeah, President Trump made a move that many sources at the time called pretty unprecedented. He issued a unilateral order, just him deciding to the Pentagon. The order was to use what was described as all available funds. Specifically, they earmarked $8 billion that Congress had actually set aside for Defense Department R&D research and development. And the purpose of using those R&D funds? To make sure military service members got their regular paychecks on time, October 15th.
Right. And if that wasn't already, a messy ethical and legal situation, the executive branch also announced right around the same time that a billionaire supporter, Timothy Mellon, had donated $130 million. The stated purpose of this donation was to help cover military payroll during the impasse. So what we're looking at is a situation where, according to critics anyway, the president potentially diverted billions in specifically appropriated funds, maybe illegally, and used huge private donations to fund core government obligations.
Okay, let's pause here and really drill down on the legal and ethical tension, because this is the heart of the institutional betrayal that fueled so much public outrage and ultimately Angela's despair. We really need to understand the power of the purse and the Anti-Deficiency Act for the NCE. These are core concepts.
Definitely. The power of the purse is, it's foundational to the whole American system of government. It goes way back to the founding, the fear of a too powerful executive after the Revolutionary War. It's written right there in the Constitution. Congress, the legislative branch, holds the power to levy taxes and to appropriate all federal funds. Put simply, the president can't just spend money whenever or however they want. Congress has to explicitly say yes, where the money comes from, and exactly what it's for. It's probably the biggest check and balance on the executive branch.
Okay, so if Congress specifically said those funds were for research and development, why is moving them to pay salaries, even military salaries, such a huge legal issue?
Because of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Think of this act as the legal teeth, the enforcement mechanism for the power of the purse. It specifically prohibits federal agencies and officers from spending money or even obligating the government to spend money before Congress has specifically appropriated those funds for that exact purpose. So when the president ordered the Pentagon to take $8 billion that was meant for R&D, future tech, new systems, and use it for immediate payroll, well, legal experts argued he was diverting funds without the necessary congressional green light for that new purpose. It looked like an explicit violation of the law's mandate.
That distinction is so important for students. You can't just, take money from bucket A and move it to bucket B because it feels like the right thing to do politically or morally in that moment.
Absolutely not. Let's try an analogy. Imagine you, the NCE student, you get a big scholarship grant, but the grant paperwork says very clearly, this money is only for tuition. That's the R&D bucket. The rules explicitly forbid using it for your rent or food. That's the salaries bucket in our example. Now, if you decide on your own, hey, I'm short on rent this month, and you take $8,000 of that tuition money to pay your landlord, you've broken the terms of the agreement, you violated the specific purpose of the fund, you could be in serious trouble. Legal experts were basically arguing the executive branch did the same thing, just on a massive scale with taxpayer money.
And the precedent this could set, that's really worrying too, isn't it? If a president can just unilaterally fund the military by pulling $8 billion from R&D, what stops a future administration from pulling funds from, say, education or infrastructure to fund whatever pet project they decide is politically important. It seems like it could completely bypass Congress, eroding that whole system of checks and balances.
Exactly. It creates a crisis of trust in the process itself. Why should Congress even bother negotiating complex budget deals if the president has shown they might just fund their priorities anyway, regardless of the law?
Okay, let's pivot now to how the public reacted, because this division is absolutely crucial for understanding Angela's breakdown later, especially in her relationships. This action really split the country, largely along pretty rigid partisan lines.
It really did. On one side, you had the supporters. Their view was overwhelmingly positive. They saw it as, frankly, heroic, a pro-troop action. The president was cutting through all that frustrating political gridlock in D.C. to do what felt morally right. For military families and their supporters, it was this huge sigh of relief. It kind of vindicated that feeling that, the troops are the ones who really matter and that they deserve protection from all this political game playing, the legal stuff. That was secondary to the moral need to pay the soldiers and sailors.
But then the critics, they saw something very different.
Oh, completely different. They saw, essentially, lawlessness, an abuse of power, a violation of the Constitution that felt like it was bordering on, authoritarianism. There was real alarm. People felt it showed a kind of contempt for the rule of law itself. You heard cynical jokes about the president just finding big, beautiful funds hidden in the Pentagon's couch cushions, but underneath that sarcasm, there was a deep fear about accountability, or the lack of it.
And all this political drama, all this division, it landed right on the shoulders of the furloughed federal workers, people like Angela.
Yeah.
While the military, who are politically powerful and very sympathetic, got this lifeline.
Hundreds of thousands of other federal workers, USDA, IRS, national parks, you name it, were just left hanging, still without pay.
The sense of inequity must have been just crushing. They felt like political pawns, right? Deliberately sacrificed to create leverage in the negotiations, while this other group, politically favored, got special, maybe even extra legal help.
Yeah, and you heard that sentiment echoed a lot. Like one furloughed USDA employee reportedly said something like, we keep the food supply safe, we run the nutrition programs, but we're completely invisible until they need us for political sacrifice. Yeah. That feeling, that shift from being a dedicated public servant to just discarded leverage, that's the toxic environment that ultimately triggered Angela's crisis.
Okay, let's move now to the client herself. Let's introduce Angela. She's 42, works at the Department of Agriculture, and as we said, she's been furloughed for over 3 weeks when she seeks help. This is the person whose internal world we're going to map out for NCE purposes.
Right. So when she comes into therapy, Her stated reasons are really acute, very focused. She reports crippling insomnia. She just cannot concentrate at home. She feels like she's unraveling physically and mentally. And there's this intense anger bubbling up, specifically that politics has robbed her of her stability.
Yeah.
And this is after 2 decades in public service. So she's experiencing this fundamental rupture in her belief, her faith, and the very system she dedicated her life to.
And we absolutely have to ground this in the financial strain, too. We can't just talk about the ideals. There's a harsh reality here. This isn't abstract. 3 weeks with no paycheck. That means maxed out credit cards. It means canceling necessary things like her son's orthodontist appointment. It means the family is literally down to eating, as she put it, rice and beans and hope.
Exactly. And that kind of chronic financial insecurity, it activates the nervous system in a way that, a sudden, sharp stress just doesn't. It's a constant grinding threat.
But here's the critical distinction, right? The financial stress was maybe the ongoing pressure, the cause of the overall stress.
But the executive action, paying only the military, that was the breaking point. That was the specific trigger for the moral injury. When that news hit, Angela described it as an immediate physical slap in the face.
And that leads directly into this erosion of her identity. Let's unpack this idea of invisible labor in public service. She apparently loves her brother, who's in the Air Force, and she's genuinely glad he got paid. But her question is,
what about us, right? What about the people who make sure the food supply doesn't collapse? What about the people running the nutrition programs?
It's that painful realization that her work, food safety, nutrition programs, it's vital, but it's unseen, invisible.
Yes, she felt like the system, the government she served, was telling her loud and clear, uniform service, that counts, that matters.
Sure.
But the bureaucratic service, the stuff that keeps the lights on and the country safe day to day, that doesn't count. Not really. That perception, that feeling of we're invisible until something goes wrong and we're disposable when there's a crisis, that's a massive blow to her sense of purpose, her self-worth. It leads straight to this feeling of deep moral injury. She felt she did the right thing, dedicated her career to service, but the system itself violated her trust.
And this internal crisis, this stress, it didn't stay internal. It started to metastasize, didn't it? It ruptured her most important relationships. The argument with her father sounds particularly devastating. He's a retired Army veteran, a Trump supporter. That confrontation seems like it was the final straw.
Oh, absolutely devastating. Because it came from someone she trusted, someone whose service presumably informed her own path. When she tried to share her despair, her feeling of betrayal, her father didn't just disagree politically. He minimized her service entirely. He apparently said something like, well, at least he took care of the people who really served this country.
Oof.
Yeah. That's not just a political disagreement. That's a profound dismissal of her entire career, her identity, her dignity.
So she loses it, understandably, shouts, I serve too, but it doesn't lead to understanding.
No. The outcome was just silence and this deep feeling that the relationship was fundamentally broken.
Think about that from her perspective. And for you listening, preparing for the NCE, in the span of maybe a week, her identity rooted in public service, maybe validated by her father's own veteran status, gets denied. Denied by her government and by her closest relative. Her whole sense of belonging just collapses.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears now from the story, the narrative, to the clinical assessment side. How do we frame this for the NCE? Her presenting problem, broadly, we'd categorize as an acute adjustment-related stress response. That includes the insomnia, the pervasive anger we talked about, generalized worry, and this profound disillusionment, all following that prolonged furlough and the perceived institutional betrayal.
And we see the impact immediately in the biological factors, right?
Yeah.
The body's keeping score.
Absolutely. Angela's reporting chronic disrupted sleep, her appetite is suppressed, frequent tension headaches, heart palpitations, even noticing a slight tremor in her hands and jaw sometimes, along with shallow breathing. This is the body's alarm system just stuck in the on position.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial NCE concept. Sympathetic activation and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. We need to go a bit deeper than just saying fight or flight.
Right. So the sympathetic nervous system, that's your body's accelerator pedal. When you perceive a threat, whether it's a real physical danger or a psychological one like a maxed out credit card or reading that news story, it kicks in immediately, gets you ready to act. At the same time, the HPA axis, which is like your internal chemical stress factory, gets mobilized. It starts pumping out stress hormones, mainly cortisol, which are essential for giving you that immediate burst of energy.
But the problem here is the duration, isn't it?
Exactly. In an acute stress situation, Swerving to avoid a car crash, the system saved your life. Then it resets. But for Angela, the threat isn't going away, it's chronic. She doesn't know when her paycheck is coming. She doesn't know if her job, her service is even valued anymore. So her body's accelerator pedal is essentially jammed down. The HPA axis keeps pumping out cortisol. And that prolonged flood of cortisol causes all sorts of problems. It can suppress the immune system, mess with digestion, like her appetite loss, cause those chronic tension headaches, and lead to that state of hyperarousal that makes restorative sleep impossible. She's experiencing biological exhaustion because her nervous system honestly believes she is constantly running from a predator.
Wow. Okay, moving to the psychological factors. She's dealing with these intrusive worries, questioning her whole career choice. I gave my life to something that doesn't care if I eat. That's powerful. And her thinking patterns, her mind, is showing classic signs of cognitive distortions.
Yes, this is definitely prime NCE territory. When people are facing chaos and uncertainty, our brains often create these mental shortcuts, but they can distort reality. We see at least 3 really strong ones in Angela's case. First, there's catastrophizing. Her thoughts are dominated by the worst-case scenarios. This will never end. We're going to lose the house. I'll never find another job. She's jumping to this devastating, inevitable future based on the current stress, not necessarily on objective probability.
Okay, second portion.
Personalization. Even though this shutdown is clearly a massive systemic failure way beyond her control, she starts internalizing the blame, thinking things like, it's my fault for staying loyal to this failing system. She takes this external chaos and assumes some personal flaw on her part must be the reason.
And the third one.
Overgeneralization. After this specific experience of betrayal from the executive branch's action, she draws this massive sweeping conclusion. No one in government actually cares. All politicians are just selfish. She takes this one negative event, the selective pay order, and applies that failure to the entire concept of government and public service. It just shatters her civic faith completely.
Got it. And let's quickly wrap the BPS picture with the social and spiritual factors. Socially, her husband is supportive but seems withdrawn, maybe dealing with his own secondary stress. The rupture with her father is still there, unaddressed. And her work environment. Those coworker group chats, they're a double-edged sword, aren't they?
Yeah, they're a lifeline in one way, providing connection, but they can also become this echo chamber, just amplifying the collective despair and anger, making it harder for her to gain any distance or perspective.
And spiritually?
Profound disillusionment, the perceived unfairness, the explicit dismissal of her work's value. It seems to have shattered her faith, not just in government institutions, but maybe in broader concepts of justice or fairness, perhaps even challenging her views on the cultural Christianity she mentioned, given the perceived lack of fairness.
Okay, now for the developmental context. Another key area for the NCE. Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. Angela is 42. That puts her squarely in the midlife stage, which Erikson called generativity versus stagnation.
Yes, and this is a perfect clinical application of that stage. Generativity, in Erikson's model, is that drive we feel in midlife to create or nurture things that will outlast us. It's about contributing to society, mentoring younger people, leaving a positive mark. Angela's 2 decades in public service, ensuring food safety, running nutrition programs, that was her generative purpose. She felt she was building something valuable, contributing meaningfully. The shutdown, and especially that message that her service was disposable, it violently fractured that sense of purpose.
It basically robbed her of her ability to contribute, to be generative.
Precisely. It threw her right back towards stagnation. Instead of feeling productive, valuable, needed, she felt purposeless. It led to that profound self-doubt, questioning the value of her entire life's work up to that point. So you see, the political failure didn't just impact her bank account, it attacked the core psychological task of her developmental stage.
Okay, this brings us to that really pivotal and honestly quite delicate moment in therapy, the rupture. It happens when the therapist introduces a somatic grounding technique focusing on breath, body awareness.
Yeah.
Angela stiffens up. She perceives it as dismissive.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And this is where clinical skill meets ethical complexity head on. Angela challenges the therapist directly. She asks, you mean just breathe through it, like that's supposed to make this okay? And then, crucially, she projects that feeling of systemic betrayal onto the therapist, saying something like, it sounds like you're telling me not to trust my own thoughts. That feels like gaslighting.
Wow, that accusation, gaslighting, that requires immediate, really skillful handling. We need to be clear, for our students listening, what gaslighting actually is. It's a term used a lot culturally. What's the clinical definition?
Right. Clinically speaking, gaslighting isn't just disagreeing with someone. It's a specific, often deliberate, psychological manipulation tactic. The perpetrator tries to make the victim doubt their own memory, their perception of events, even their sanity. The ultimate goal is usually to undermine the victim's autonomy and make them distrust their own reality, making them more dependent on the manipulator. When Angela's government effectively tells her her service doesn't count, or when her father minimizes her suffering, you could argue they are effectively gaslighting her reality, her experience of service and pain.
So when she turns that lens, that accusation, onto the therapist, that's a moment of profound therapeutic rupture. It could derail everything. The counselor has to respond ethically, drawing on the ACA Code of Ethics. You mentioned 8.4b, personal values, and 8.1a, client welfare.
Absolutely. The counselor's first internal step is immediate self-monitoring. Specifically, checking for political countertransference. If the counselor has strong feelings about the shutdown, the president, the politics, and who wouldn't, they absolutely must bracket those feelings. Their own political views cannot influence their judgment or their response in that moment. The priority always is unconditional positive regard and the client's welfare. A1A.
What about nonverbals? What does the therapist need to do physically in that moment, knowing Angela is likely highly aroused, suspicious, maybe feeling attacked?
Great point. The therapist needs to immediately regulate their own nervous system, slow down their breathing noticeably, maintain an open, calm, non-defensive posture, maybe lean in slightly to show engagement, lower their voice tone slightly. Any sign of defensiveness from the therapist, a quick denial, a raised voice, pulling back would instantly validate Angela's fear that she's being manipulated or dismissed again. The initial response must be validating, not corrective or instructional.
So the first words out of the therapist's mouth should be validation, even though the accusation of gaslighting might not be technically accurate for the therapist's intent.
Precisely. You validate the feeling behind the accusation first. Something like, that makes complete sense why you'd feel that way. Or, thank you for telling me that. It makes sense you're wary. You've had experiences, especially recently, where people, even systems you trusted, have made you doubt your reality and dismissed your pain. You join with her perception of being invalidated. That's the essential first step to rebuilding trust right there in the room.
Okay, so once that validation lands, then the therapist can make the crucial distinction. They need to differentiate between invalidating her cognition, telling her her thoughts or feelings are wrong, which would be gaslighting, and regulating her physiology, which is the actual goal of this somatic work.
Exactly. The therapist clarifies the intent, carefully. Something like, I hear you, and let me be really clear. Your thoughts and feelings about being betrayed, they are completely valid and accurate based on what you've experienced. We are not working on changing those thoughts or telling you they're wrong. What we are exploring gently is how to help your body, your nervous system, understand that even though the system out there feels chaotic and unsafe right now, your physical body is actually safe right here in this room, in this moment.
So the therapist is essentially saying, I validate your mind's interpretation of events, and I want to help your body catch up to the present safety, granting her cognitive autonomy while teaching physiological autonomy.
You got it. The goal is empowerment, not dismissal. The therapeutic relationship itself becomes a corrective experience. It models the kind of trustworthy, predictable connection that Angela has lost with her institutions. By respecting her fear, validating her perception, and patiently clarifying the purpose of the intervention, the therapist empowers her to start regaining what we sometimes call autonomic sovereignty, gaining some conscious influence over her internal state, regardless of the external chaos. This is such a critical ethical and clinical pivot point for any counselor working with trauma or systemic stress.
Okay, that was crucial. Now let's move into the more structured NCE preparation section, the clinical formulation. Let's lock down the diagnosis and really unpack the theoretical frameworks that were integrated here. It seems like a layered approach.
Yes, definitely layered. So the primary provisional diagnosis we land on is adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood. F43.23, according to the DSM-5-TR. Why? Because it fits perfectly. Her symptoms, the insomnia, anxiety, sadness, anger, are a direct, acute reaction to an identifiable, significant external stressor. That stressor is the furlough and the perceived betrayal. And crucially, these symptoms are causing clear functional impairment in her life, at home, relationally, and likely would professionally if she were working.
Got it. And what are the mandatory rule-outs, the differential diagnoses that NCE students absolutely need to consider and be able to justify ruling out?
The two big ones to rule out here are generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, F41.1, and a major depressive episode, MDE, F32.x. Let's take GA first. GAD is characterized by chronic, excessive worry that's pervasive. It happens across multiple areas of life, not just tied to one thing. And critically, it has to last for 6 months or more. Often, it doesn't have one single, clear, acute trigger like Angela's situation does. Angela's worry, while intense, is very clearly and primarily tethered to this specific political and financial crisis that started just 3 weeks ago. Now, if her symptoms were to persist, say 6 months after the shutdown ended and her paychecks resumed, then we might need to revisit GAD. But right now, adjustment disorder is the better fit.
Okay, and why rule out MDE as the primary diagnosis? She does have some depressive symptoms.
She does. She has sadness, maybe some loss of appetite, which can overlap. But a formal major depressive episode requires meeting a specific threshold. 5 or more symptoms from a list, present nearly every day for at least 2 weeks. And one of those symptoms must be either pervasive depressed mood or anhedonia, a marked loss of interest or pleasure in almost all activities. More importantly, the DSM specifies that the symptoms shouldn't be better explained by another disorder, like adjustment disorder. Since Angela's distress is so clearly linked to this massive, ongoing, identifiable stressor and developed shortly after it began, adjustment disorder is considered the more accurate, specific, and provisional diagnosis for now. It directly reflects the cause and effect relationship.
That clarity focusing on the duration, the pervasiveness, and that direct link to the stressor is absolutely essential for the NCE. Okay, now let's dive into those theoretical frameworks. The approach described integrates existential, feminist, and polyvagal-informed somatic therapy. That's a sophisticated blend. Let's break them down.
Okay, starting with existential therapy. This framework speaks directly to Angela's crisis of meaning and purpose. Existential therapy grapples with the big questions, meaning choice, freedom, responsibility, isolation, and facing life's inherent limitations or futility. Angela's crisis is a rupture of purpose. From an existential perspective, her despair isn't just seen as pathology, it's reframed as moral sensitivity. She feels betrayed precisely because she holds deep values about service, fairness, and loyalty. So therapy using this lens wouldn't try to just make the despair go away. It would explore questions like, okay, the system you believed in has failed you. What values still hold true for you internally, regardless of external validation? The goal is to help her shift from relying on external institutions for her sense of worth towards finding intrinsic meaning anchored in her own deeply held moral code and choices.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the feminist therapy lens, how does that apply specifically here beyond just general empowerment?
Feminist therapy starts with the core principle that the personal is political. It analyzes how psychological distress often arises from or is exacerbated by systemic power imbalances, social injustices, patriarchal structures, and restrictive gender role expectations. So Angela's anger. It's not just seen as a symptom to manage, it's validated as a completely justifiable and healthy response to an unfair, oppressive system. We look at her specific work food safety, nutrition programs. This is often categorized as invisible labor, historically associated with female caregiving roles, and systemically undervalued compared to, say, the traditionally male-dominated high-status role of the uniformed military. The government's choice to prioritize military pay felt like a direct enactment of that systemic bias. Feminist therapy helps her recontextualize that feeling of being discarded leverage. It's not a personal failing, it's a manifestation of systemic oppression against undervalued forms of labor and service. The goal then becomes empowering her to reclaim her narrative, I serve too, and potentially channeling that righteous anger into constructive action or advocacy rather than just internalizing it as shame or failure.
Okay, that raises a really interesting point, though. If existential therapy is pushing her towards finding meaning internally, focusing on her choices, but feminist therapy is validating her anger at external systems, essentially saying the blame lies out there. How does a counselor manage that potential tension? How do you stop it from just becoming an exercise in blaming the system without taking personal responsibility for her response?
That is the art of integration right there. It's about holding both realities simultaneously. The counselor makes it explicit for Angela, something like, yes, your anger is justified. The system is unfair, and what happened was wrong. That's the feminist validation. And the only thing you ultimately have control over is how you respond to that unfairness and the meaning you choose to make from this experience. That's the existential focus on choice and responsibility. You validate the external cause, absolutely, but the therapeutic work focuses on strengthening her internal responsibility. So you use the feminist lens to validate the anger and contextualize the injustice, and you use the existential lens to help her metabolize that anger into a renewed, internally driven, values-based purpose. They work together.
Okay, excellent clarification.
Yeah.
Finally, let's circle back to the polyvagal-informed somatic therapy. This seems crucial for calming her overloaded nervous system. Students really need a solid grasp of the polyvagal states. Can you break those down again simply?
Sure. Polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, gives us a more nuanced map of our autonomic nervous system than just fight or flight. It focuses on the vagus nerve and describes a hierarchy of 3 main response states shaped by evolution based on perceived safety or threat. At the top, the most recently evolved state is the ventral vagal complex. This is our state of safety, connection, social engagement. When we're here, we feel calm, grounded, curious. We can connect with others, learn, digest food properly, sleep well. Think of Angela when she feels calm, connected to her husband, able to focus. That's ventral vagal.
Okay, then the threat responses kick in if safety is lost.
Right. If the nervous system detects danger, it shifts down the hierarchy. The first stop is sympathetic activation. This is the classic fight or flight, mobilization, energy surges. This is Angela's state of hyperarousal. The racing heart, tension headaches, shallow breathing, feeling agitated or anxious. Her body is preparing to confront or escape the danger.
And if that doesn't work, or the threat feels inescapable,
then the system can drop down further into the oldest defense pathway, the dorsal vagal complex. This is a state of shutdown, collapse, immobilization. Think of an animal playing dead or freezing. In humans, this can manifest as feeling numb, disconnected, dissociated, hopeless, heavy, maybe even ashamed, profound withdrawal. Appetite suppression, like Angela experienced, can be part of this. Her inability to concentrate and feeling of unraveling could also reflect shifts into this dorsal vagal state due to the chronic, overwhelming, inescapable nature of the stress. The goal of polyvagal-informed therapy is to help the client recognize these states and gently guide their nervous system back up the ladder towards the safety and connection of the ventral vagal state.
that detailed map leads us perfectly into the specific interventions used. First, somatic grounding techniques.
Right. The rationale here is pure polyvagal theory. The techniques themselves are simple but powerful. Things like guiding Angela to notice her feet on the floor, maybe press them down firmly, or encouraging a slow, extended exhale, making the out-breath longer than the in-breath. Even a simple self-holding posture, like gently placing a hand on her heart and one on her belly, or hugging her knees. These actions send direct safety cues to the vagus nerve. They help downregulate that sympathetic hyperarousal, and crucially, they help her body learn to differentiate. Okay, my thoughts are about danger, but my body right now is actually safe. It rebuilds that connection between mind and present moment bodily experience.
Okay, second intervention, values narrative reconstruction. This sounds like the existential piece in action.
Exactly. This uses techniques like therapeutic journaling with specific prompts, maybe asking Angela to write about, even if the system fails, what core values do I still believe in? Or what kind of public servant do I want to be, regardless of external recognition? Or even, what kind of world am I still willing to work towards, even when it feels broken? The rationale is existential, transforming that external loss, job security, institutional validation, into internal integrity. It helps her rebuild her sense of purpose from the inside out, anchoring it in her own enduring values rather than relying on the fickle validation of institutions or political wins.
Makes sense. And finally, media hygiene and boundaries.
This draws on our understanding of psychoneuroimmunology, basically, how stress impacts the nervous system and immune system. Constantly consuming distressing news, especially about a crisis directly impacting you, is like injecting yourself with cortisol, drip by drip. It keeps the HPA axis firing, keeps the sympathetic system ramped up, so the intervention is practical. Collaborating with Angela to create structured, intentional media windows, maybe limiting news intake to 15 minutes twice a day, and consciously choosing not to check news right before bed or first thing in the morning. And importantly, pairing those media windows with mandatory grounding practices immediately afterward to help her nervous system settle again. It's about reducing the constant inflammatory input and protecting her overall physical and mental health from overload.
Angela's journey really drives home that mind-body connection, doesn't it? Especially when dealing with these huge systemic crises. I like that psychoeducation piece. When your government breaks its promises, your nervous system feels abandonment. That's biology, not weakness.
Yes, that framing is so important. It validates her intense physiological reactions, removing the shame or self-blame. Her body wasn't malfunctioning. It was acting like a perfectly calibrated antenna, picking up on the signals of collective political stress and institutional betrayal, and using that polyvagal mapping in session, helping her visualize her own cycle. Okay, I read that article, threat perception, my heart starts racing, sympathetic activation, then later I just feel numb and exhausted, dorsal vagal collapse. Just naming those states, identifying them as predictable nervous system responses, starts to build her tolerance for the uncertainty. She can begin to think, okay, I'm not going crazy. My body is just doing what bodies do when they feel profoundly unsafe.
And the turning point you mentioned, achieving autonomic sovereignty, that moment she realizes, nothing out there has actually changed yet, but I don't feel like I'm constantly falling apart anymore. That signifies that shift, right? From being totally dictated by the external chaos to finding some sense of internal coherence and regulation.
That really is the core gift of effective therapy in these kinds of situations, I think. It's about helping people cultivate the capacity to stay internally regulated, even when the external world feels fundamentally unregulated or unsafe. We're helping the client reclaim some measure of autonomy over their own nervous system. We help them metabolize those intense, difficult feelings, the anger, the betrayal, the despair, and transform them into something constructive, like renewed purpose or targeted action, rather than letting those feelings become paralyzing or purely destructive.
And that really underscores that essential therapeutic order you mentioned earlier. Regulation before cognition. Calm the body first. Validation before intervention. Acknowledge the pain before trying to fix it. And connection before correction. Build trust before offering new perspectives.
Couldn't say it better. And never underestimate the power of the therapeutic alliance itself as an intervention. By carefully navigating that moment around gaslighting, by respecting Angela's fear, validating her experience, and patiently working to repair that potential rupture, the therapist models the very trustworthiness, reliability, and safety that Angela felt had vanished from her public institutions and even her family relationships. The relationship itself heals.
So let's bring this home for our listeners. Maybe you're dealing with similar feelings of chronic political stress, or maybe you work in public service yourself and you're feeling disillusioned or burnt out by the system. What are the clear signs that professional help might be needed?
Right.
When should someone with a history, maybe similar to Angela's, consider seeking therapy?
Yeah, great question. The indicators are usually pretty persistent and start impacting daily life. I'd say seek help if you're experiencing persistent insomnia or physical symptoms like tension headaches that just don't let up, even maybe a week or two after an immediate crisis seems to have calmed down. If you notice significant emotional blunting, feeling numb or disconnected much of the time, or pervasive irritability or hopelessness that sticks around, if you're experiencing relationship conflict fatigue, just feeling exhausted because every conversation seems to devolve into political arguments or misunderstandings, especially with loved ones. Or maybe paradoxically, if you find yourself needing constant overexposure to distressing media just to feel prepared or informed, but it leaves you feeling agitated and drained. Therapy, in this context, isn't about ignoring the problems out there. It's really about helping you metabolize that understandable systemic anger into personal purpose and resilience, rather than letting it consume you or lead to burnout.
Excellent. Okay, to wrap things up, let's do a quick review of the mandatory NCE concepts this case study really highlighted. Let's solidify this for exam preparation.
Okay, key takeaways. In ethics, really nail down that distinction between disagreeing with a client's thought versus disconfirming their lived experience. Always validate the experience first. And specifically, review those ACA ethical standards. A1A on client welfare being the primary responsibility, and 8.4B on consciously monitoring your personal values and potential countertransference, especially around hot-button political issues.
Got it. For assessment.
Practice distinguishing adjustment disorder, F43.23. Remember, it's directly linked to an external stressor and causes impairment from more chronic diagnoses like GAD or MDE. Focus on the time course, the direct trigger, and the pervasiveness of symptoms.
Okay. Development.
Be ready to apply Erickson's stages. Midlife. Think generativity versus stagnation. How can a major external crisis impact someone's core developmental task of contributing and finding meaning? Angela's crisis was fundamentally rooted in that loss of generative purpose.
And finally, theory integration.
Right. You need to be able to articulate why you might use a layered approach. Justify integrating frameworks like existential for meaning, purpose, values, feminist for validating anger related to systemic injustice and power dynamics, and somatic polyvagal for down-regulating the physiological stress response. Show how they complement each other.
And for further study based just on this case,
Definitely reread the specific DSM-5-TR diagnostic criteria for adjustment disorder, and absolutely do a deeper dive into the core principles of polyvagal theory. Make sure you can clearly explain and differentiate the ventral vagal, sympathetic, and dorsal vagal states and their implications for therapy.
this case really is a powerful reminder, isn't it? How global politics, national crises, they don't just stay out there. They walk right into the therapy room, landing squarely on the couch. It demands so much from us as counselors. Ethical rigor, deep theoretical knowledge, and a really sophisticated understanding of the human nervous system's response to threat and betrayal.
It really does. And maybe it leaves us with a final provocative thought for everyone listening, especially students preparing to enter the field. Our job, increasingly, isn't just about managing individual symptoms of distress. It's also about helping clients navigate the incredibly difficult process of reconstructing faith in their community, faith in their own purpose, especially when the very institutions they once relied on seem to be actively undermining that trust, that capacity to facilitate reconstruction, to hold hope amidst systemic failure. That might just define the core work of counseling in the years ahead.
Thank you for listening to the NCE StudyGuide Podcast. If you found this deep dive helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate us 5 stars wherever you listen, and maybe share with your friends and colleagues who are also studying. And don't forget to check out our Patreon library. We've got over 100 topic-specific training modules available there, covering all sorts of NCE content for as little as $5 per month.
1, 2, 3.